Do we have any super chat questions before we wrap?
Yep. So we got one from Carlos, and Carlos says, been talking to people who support the protests and the curfew. How to talk to normies about curfews and public safety. And he also just adds up, would that include political education in the movement?
I would really actually, with things like curfews, I would really start with a very broad conversation about civil liberties. People really need to understand that those moves to block people's ability to do any kind of protest is a fundamental threat to a constitutional order that most people take very seriously. So I would strongly emphasize that. Then I think you can kind of open up, depending on somebody's receptivity, look, in order for, and we know this historically, that protests that achieve things, including, frankly, first and foremost, ones that tend to, nonviolent tactics, are always still predicated on disrupting the flow of things. Like, there is a different energy if you're standing in front of the Barclays Center, and it's great. It's really, it's all important. Whatever anybody's doing, zero, like, not even a comment, let alone judgment. But I'm just saying, like, you stand, people speak. There's some rallies. It's there. It's contained. Then you go and you say, walk up Flatbush, and you're blocking the flow of traffic, and you're having. It's just a completely different interaction. It's a completely different consequence. So if people have receptivity and some seriousness about the crisis that's being highlighted, then you can open the broader door. The third thing I would say is that this, as is the case with so many things, you do need to be quite mindful of those, normie opinions and those enormous contradictions in public opinion polling. There's some real movement in public opinion polling for civil rights, for reform. I think that there is, in terms of these issues, in terms of policing, in terms of understanding the racism, lethality, and brutalism of police. Beyond that, in order to get to, so for me, I don't fetishize various slogans. I actually have basically the function of policing as it exists now needs to be split up into several different functions. And a vast majority of these things either need to be things that, frankly, we're not policing because we're not doing broken windows to terrorize Black and brown communities and to uphold class structure. And also other things like, people who are having like mental health problems, they should, social workers, caregivers, things like that need to be deployed, not people with guns. So I think that, again, I don't emphasize tracking polls and thinking somewhat clearly about where majorities are at because I want people to limit their political horizon. I just want us to actually take those things into account so that potentially radical things can be accomplished. Because if we don't do that, then it really ultimately becomes, especially frankly for people kind of involved from positions of relative privilege, just emotional catharsis, and that's not going to achieve anything. So I would think of really those kind of three things in terms of, quote unquote normie conversations. I also think things are really fluid. I have seen, social media anecdotes of very insulated middle-class white people going from, seeing, the murder of George Floyd, doing bad apple talk, which I love, as Chris Rock said, bad apples is a very nice term for murderers. Then, as this has gone over the week, pivoting into a slightly larger understanding, like all of a sudden, wait a second, understanding that Breonna Taylor was killed, starting to track a little bit of a larger understanding around racism and policing and police viciousness, up until seeing the response to the protests and actually starting to have a Why are these police departments so militarized across the board? What is their actual function? What the hell is going on here? So I also think things are very, very fluid. And a fun stat on the flip side was, and I love that it said somewhat, because when they do these polls, it's always like, somewhat, or I forget what, or very favorable or somewhat favorable. 53% of people were somewhat favorable of burning down that precinct where Chauvin came from. It's actually an incredible stat.
Yeah, I think that's right. And all the polling that we have basically confirms that people are in support of the protests, that people see, and they clearly recognize the overstep that police have taken. They're against the militarization of the police, that they think that the murders are horrific. I think where some of the polling gets a little bit more, there's less support, or it's a little bit more all over the place, is when it comes down to the actual political solutions of how do we actually live in a society where, we make sure that people are not the victims of crime, but simultaneously we don't have a police force that looks like and acts like an invading army that brutalizes, people who are historically marginalized, people who are in neighborhoods that, because of redlining and these other, horrific, practices of the past, and have been only concretized by neoliberalism and entrenched these people into poverty, that, how do we actually put forward a solution that actually addresses social ills and poverty, but, taking care of people, taking care of people's needs, growing solidarity among people. And so I think what we're seeing is, in real time, the protests figuring out how to, concretize these political demands. And I think there's increasing, people are increasingly more and more favorable towards the protesters and towards the demands. And so
it's incredible courage. So it's, anyway, yeah. What's the next one?